In my doctoral program at the University of Maryland, I started really exploring if men are harmed by men's violence against women and sexism and patriarchy, if men are harmed by that, what are the other consequences? Right? What else does men's socialization lead to? And then I really got into the critical men and masculinities literature. And one of the scholars I came across was Harry Broad, who was a philosophy professor at Northern Iowa. He's passed away, but he was really a men's study scholar. And he said many brilliant things that I read, but one of them was men obviously benefit from concrete and real privileges being a man in a sexist patriarchal society. And we would be better off without them. And I went, what? And that notion that as a man, and I'm a white man, and I'm a heterosexual man, and I'm able bodied, I have a lot of privileged identities. And the awareness that I get concrete and real privileges I didn't earn and don't deserve. I've earned some things and I deserve some things, but I get some of that I didn't earn and I don't deserve, that I would be better off without them. If I could eliminate racism in the world that I live in, I would give up some of those concrete and real privileges, but what I would gain would be so much better. My humanity, an accurate sense of self, relationships across those differences, all the barriers that would come down. The world that I live in would be safer, crime would be down, taxes would be lower because more people would
Hmm.
be employed. They wouldn't be this cost of racism. How many incredible inventions didn't happen because we wouldn't let women or people of color in the room to be a part of the conversation, right? How much would my life be better if inventions, surgery, politicians, right, had happened? And so that, what I call enlightened self-interest, how people of dominance, of privilege, who benefit from the systems of oppression, if we can pay attention to the ways that we would be better off without those systems of oppression, that completely shifts how we engage and how we approach. Have you ever seen white people that are just bash white people? Oh, white people and the things white people have done throughout history. It's an abomination. I'm like, okay, yeah,
As if they are not also a white
yeah,
person who is
exactly.
benefiting and
Right,
participating.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or men who just bash men, like, oh, can you believe
Oh
the shit
man.
men do? Oh my God, men are
Hmm. The
terrible.
worst.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. And I've done that. I've absolutely done that. So I'm not above all of this. But what I've noticed is when I'm in that place, I think people who experience marginalization, when they're in that place, they're really trying to distance themselves from people who have hurt them. Right. So when women bash men, they're trying to distance from men who have hurt them. Maybe men in their lives, maybe society, maybe men at large. When I do it, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to distance myself from a previous version of myself that I can no longer be with.
Mm.
So when I bash white people, what I'm doing is I want distance from that version of me that said affirmative action is reverse racism, that I can no longer be with that perspective. And I'm ashamed that I once thought that. And so bashing white people is a great way to distance myself and say, but I'm one of the good ones. You can trust me. You can connect with me. You can be in relationship with me. You don't have to question my intentions. And so that's really separation. And when people give us feedback, hey, I love the talk, but I think that joke was a little sexist, then you get defensive because you're trying to prove I'm a good one. And that feedback is something to be defensive about because you're trying to maintain this perspective that I'm one of the good ones. No, you don't understand. I'm
Hmm.
Dr. Keith Edwards. I have a
That's right.
PhD. I started this thing and I've done. And every time I get defensive, at this point, I get defensive plenty. And I start in my head to run the resume. And when I get defensive and I start to think, run the resume, like I've no, that's my red flag. And that's when I try and move to this enlightened self-interest. So if someone comes up to me and says, love the talk. I thought that example was a little sexist. I go, get in touch with your enlightened self-interest. If this person can help you understand a sexism within you that you are unaware of, that is a gift toward your own liberation. And you don't need to be defensive about that. You should welcome that. This is a gift, right? And when I have that enlightened self interest, any feedback about my sexism, about my ableism, about my non-inclusiveness is just, yeah, I'd love because I know I'm a good person. And that's not a threat to me being a good person. I'm a good person who has been taught racist things my whole life. I've been taught sexist things my whole life. I've unlearned a lot of it. And you know what happens as soon as you unlearn it? You go out in the world and you get taught it again. By social
Again and
media,
again.
by music. So
Yep.
it's not like we got socialized until we were 13 and then it stopped. I'm being socialized every day of my life in these ways. So the unlearning is really important. If I think I know how the world works and functions and someone comes along and says, actually, that's not how that is. That's how racism works. I go, oh, I got to unlearn all of that. And unlearning is really challenging. And then once you unlearn, then you get socialized and you got to relearn, you got to be reminded, you got to have another example, you got to read another Bell Hooks book, and then you got to see it play out here. And then you see it in this documentary, and then you see in this poem, and you're like, oh, and then you see a model of it. And then eventually you go from knowing racism exists and white privilege exists to then doing that in conversations and getting the feedback and being criticized and welcoming it as a gift and being open to it and learning that you can say racist things and get that feedback and welcome it and apologize and take responsibility. And you still get to be on podcasts like this, right? Or maybe you get to be on podcasts like this because of that, right?
This is Social Justice Origin Stories. I'm your host, Rolando Tompkins Jones. Social Justice Origin Stories is a storytelling project that highlights personal stories and defining moments that have inspired individuals and organizations to labor for equity and social justice. Through truth telling, the honest sharing of their experiences, storytellers teach us about themselves, enabling us to learn about ourselves and our world through their stories. By reconnecting with pivotal moments of activation in their lives, they invite us to do the same. At Social Justice Origin Stories, we believe that there's power in storytelling and lived experience is experience. There's room enough for all of us to do this work. There are many ways to contribute, and our contributions don't need to be the same. We can enter and remain engaged in the work using the gifts that are special to us while supporting others and using theirs. We have the capacity to grow and change for the better when exposed to new information and experiences. We believe in our inherent worth and capabilities, and we possess the power to inspire and create change within ourselves and others. We can transcend the confines of the status quo to imagine and design more equitable and humanizing systems. Today, we have Dr. Keith Edwards. He was one of the earliest supporters of social justice origin stories in its earliest form. So before it became this audio visual form of storytelling, it was based in a series on a blog I started back in 2011 called Notes from an Inspiring Humanitarian. And I created a series called the People Who Inspire series. Very early on in that process, Dr. Edwards signed on and shared some of his storytelling. So I'm very happy to have him back today to join us as we transition what was that project into something that I'm really hopeful will reach and inspire many people into reflection, but then also into action.
My name's Keith Edwards. My pronouns are he, him, his. Right now, I'm a speaker, author, and coach working on my own. I have a background in higher education and student affairs. I was the director of campus life at McAllister College in St. Paul, Minnesota for 8 years. Left that role in 2015. In the past 9 years, I've been working on my own, having conversations like this. My work is focused on empowering transformation for a better tomorrow. I do that around leadership, around learning, and around equity. And I do things around curricular approaches in higher education, around sexual violence prevention, around men and masculinity, around allyship and equity leadership. I'm a certified executive coach. So I have over 1,000 hours coaching folks around their life and where they're going and how to navigate that and all the social justice issues that come with that. And so I have a pretty eclectic life doing lots of interesting things. I've never been bored in my life. I'm always interested in new things and learning and expanding.
Reflecting on your own social justice origin story, some things that came up were your struggles as a man, your awareness of white privilege,
Mhm.
cross training and understanding enlightened self interest.
I grew up in a really small town in Wisconsin. 89 people were the number of people in my town. I lived in the schoolhouse in town, so I had to go to the next town to go to school. I graduated with the same 23 kids I went to kindergarten with. We had a lot of diversity in my school. We had people who like Fords and we had people who like Chevys. and not
Mm.
to the extent of the diversity that we had at that time. But I had spent 2 years from when I was 2 to 4 years old living in Botswana, Africa. My dad had been in the Peace Corps, and then my parents were in the International Volunteer Service, and so I don't have tremendous memories of that, but I think it shaped my vision of what the world was in a very different way from my peers who had never had that experience. Living in a mostly African environment with a few uh, US and a few Brits, but being cared for by African women in Botswana in a small rural village. And I think that shaped me. It probably foregrounded more than anything. And I think in high school, I started paying attention to issues around men. My parents were very liberal, very progressive, very equity focused. But I started paying attention to all the terrible messages about men that I was seeing, and I was really frustrated by it. So I will remember watching, I forget the name of the show, but it was with Tim Allen, and his show was Tool Time. And a lot of the dads on TV shows that I watched were bumbling. And I got really offended by that. And I started thinking about that. I went to college and I had a great college experience, a lot of leadership, a lot of equity things. And would push back on a lot of that, saying affirmative action is just reverse racism. It's not fair. White people struggle too. I grew up very working class. That's an exaggeration. We're really poor. I think I had some great learning around sexual orientation when I was in college that kind of opened my eyes. I student taught an African American history class at a high school and an Asian American history class in that same high school as a student teacher. And my master teacher was a white guy who had created the first African American history class in the state of Minnesota. And then he created the first Asian American history class in the state of Minnesota. And so watching how he did that, I think was a great model for me that I don't think I really recognized at the time because he was so not performative. He was not out there bragging about it. It was not about, look at this class I created, look at this white teacher teaching these folks. It was totally of service. It was all about the students. It was about creating an experience for them. I went to grad school, and that's where I learned about white privilege. And that was the first time I'd ever heard that idea. I love that people hear about that now in high school for other things, but I had never heard about that concept at all.
Mhm.
And learning about that was very challenging, but I was open to it. And then I got some pushback from classmates about taking up space as a man and talking over people, which was really confusing to me because my intentions were so good. And how could they be questioning me when my intentions were, you know, I'm the best of the best. This is as good as it gets, I would think. And I had an experience in my undergrad that then transferred to my grad school is that there was a guy at a RA training who said that sexual violence is not a women's issue, it's a men's issue. And I was like, what are you talking about? And I really pushed back on him. I was angry. I felt he was creating fear where fear need not exist. I felt I was being blamed for the actions of a small number of men. And I really pushed back. And over my college experience, my undergrad, I probably talked to 9 different women who I knew who had experience of sexual violence. And each time I would go back to that and think, maybe, and then no, no, that's wrong. But then when I was in grad school, I was working in fraternity and sorority life. And in 1 week, I talked to 9 survivors of sorority women who had survived sexual violence of some form and kind. And so I called that guy who I yelled at in that session and said, "You should come here and give that presentation." And I was very proud of that and brought him, and I was awful. I made him do 12 presentations in a day and a half. Don't ever do that to a campus speaker. It's terrible. But I was quite performative about it, right? I brought him, I had raised the funds, I had done this. I was very out there because I wanted people to see that I was doing this, that I was good, one of the good ones, right? And at the end of that, he said, "You should be doing this." And he didn't want to travel and speak. His daughters were the same age my daughters are now, and he didn't want to be traveling. And so then I started doing that presentation as an impression of him. His name is Troy Hedrick. He's continued to be a mentor in many different ways. And then I kept doing that presentation and I kept evolving and changing as I would go. And the core of that presentation is that sexual violence is overwhelmingly perpetrated by men. So we should stop thinking about it as a women's issue. We should think about it as a men's issue. If we're going to stop the perpetrators, then let's focus on men and what they're doing and what's going on with that. And by me as a man living in a world where sexual violence is perpetrated by men, it definitely harms women and trans folks. So, this learning about sexual violence prevention being a men's issue and how men are negatively impacted by men's violence against women, we weren't really talking about trans issues nearly as much at that point in time. merged with this white privilege and understanding racism. And then when I left that master's program, I started reading a lot from the UMass social justice program about the matrix of oppression and individual and institutional and societal and conscious and unconscious and actions and beliefs. And I was just like, you have organized all of this chaos that's been done. Now it just, oh, it just makes sense. And so I really started learning about that and sexual orientation and religion and ability and putting all of that together and started doing a lot of teaching around that and doing a lot of work about the process of learning and unlearning around equity. But then in my doctoral program at the University of Maryland, I started really exploring if men are harmed by men's violence against women and sexism and patriarchy, if men are harmed by that, what are the other consequences? Right? What else does men's socialization lead to? And then I really got into the critical men and masculinities literature. And one of the scholars I came across was Harry Broad, who was a philosophy professor at Northern Iowa. He's passed away, but he was really a men's study scholar. And he said many brilliant things that I read, but one of them was men obviously benefit from concrete and real privileges being a man in a sexist, patriarchal society. And we would be better off without them. And I went, what? And that notion that as a man, and I'm a white man, and I'm a heterosexual man, and I'm able bodied, I have a lot of privileged identities. And the awareness that I get concrete and real privileges I didn't earn and don't deserve. I've earned some things and I deserve some things, but I get some of that I didn't earn and I don't deserve, that I would be better off without them. If I could eliminate racism in the world that I live in, I would give up some of those concrete and real privileges, but what I would gain would be so much better. My humanity, an accurate sense of self, relationships across those differences, all the barriers that would come down. The world that I live in would be safer, crime would be down, taxes would be lower because more people would
Hmm.
be employed. They wouldn't be this cost of racism. How many incredible inventions didn't happen because we wouldn't let women or people of color in the room to be a part of the conversation, right? How much would my life be better if inventions, surgery, politicians, right, had happened? And so that, what I call enlightened self-interest, how people of dominance, of privilege, who benefit from the systems of oppression, if we can pay attention to the ways that we would be better off without those systems of oppression, that completely shifts how we engage and how we approach. And that has been ever since my approach to talking with men, to talking with white people, to approaching social justice, to approaching allyship. I went to NCORE, which is a great conference if people aren't familiar. It's really focused on higher ed, but it's an incredible conference on race and ethnicity. I got to see Francie Kendall, who was a consultant. I don't think she's active anymore, but she was a consultant around whiteness. And she would share her messes and mistakes. She would talk about how racist she is. And she was leading this session on white privilege and anti-racism. And I was just like, you're racist? And she was like, yeah, let me tell you how. Let me tell you the thoughts I have and how I impact them and how I do this. And I was just like, oh, me
Hmm.
too. And not only was she sharing her racist socialization, but what she did with that, how she wrestled with that, how she countered that, how she noticed it, the price she paid for it, all of those things. And I just found her incredible. And she was kind enough to mentor me along a few things and very generous with me. And then I saw her in a conversation with Tim Wise, who's a more well known speaker around whiteness and white privilege. And I saw the two of them in conversation about how white privilege and racism had harmed them as white people, relationships they had lost, humanity, connection, childhood friendship, like all of these things. And Francie Kendall told a story I'll never forget, which is she was having heart surgery. And as they rolled her into the operating room to have heart surgery, she had a panic attack. She looked up and saw the faces of 5 white men. And she wondered how far down the list of the best people in the world to do this surgery were these 5 white men, because women and people of color hadn't been included. And she had a panic attack
Hmm.
because of racism and sexism as she went in, and they had to reschedule the surgery. And that to
Yeah.
me is such a tangible way that white people pay the price of racism. When you're having heart surgery, you're not getting the best people. You're getting the people who had access and encouragement and weren't tracked into something else, or weren't tracked into the honors class, but were in the non honors, or weren't sexually harassed by their medical profession, like all the things that get in the way. And her heart surgery suffered as a result of the racism that she benefits from, but also pays the cost. And that has shaped how I thought about men and masculinities. That's shaped how I think about sexual violence and patriarchy, how I think about allyship, how I think about whiteness, and how I think about all these things.
So early on in describing your journey, describing the 90s sitcoms, and you're seeing the portrayal of the white dads and taking some issue with that. What I'm getting from that was initially there's some defensiveness around this. You didn't like the images that were being portrayed.
Why are we so mean to men? Is what I was thinking. Yeah. I
Why are
mean,
we so mean to men? So that place of defensiveness you were in, and then you're bringing the speaker in to do these workshops. And initially, you mentioned at that time it was performative. So I'm bringing them in, I'm hosting these things. What were some of the things that moved you from that place of defensiveness and
mhm,
performance to, as you described, your mentor that you
yeah,
had, where it's no, there was nothing, or your teacher, right? There was nothing negative about what this person was doing. It's no, this is for the people, this is of service.
yeah,
And so, what moved you from that place initially to how you're operating and what you try to keep in top of mind and your work
yeah.
now when it comes to
You're
not being performative?
yeah, you're pointing to this process that I've reflected a lot on, and it ended up being a article that I wrote around aspiring allyship identity development. And allyship isn't an identity, it's an action, it's something you do, but how we think about ourselves as allies, I think dramatically shifts how we show up. And so in thinking about that exact question, how did I go from this to that, to that, to that? What are the shifts? And then watching Francie Kindle and Tim Wise, I sat in that session hearing them and I was mapping out this table and that table's like 75% of what's in the actual article that I still use to
Mhm,
this day that was published in
mhm.
2007. And I probably think about that allyship model, those three different statuses of allyship every day. I slip up all the time. I get in a conversation and I think, I have a reaction and I think, oh, I got to slow down. I got to think about this a little bit more. And so the three steps I talk about are self interest, which is when you do it for your friends and people you care about. Then there's altruism, when you do it for all those who experience oppression. And then this enlightened self interest. And when you do it for someone you care about, like your brother John comes out and now you speak out against homophobic jokes and comments, but you don't do it when John's not around because all you really care about is protecting John, right? It's very personal. And I think that's often where people start, right?
Mhm.
They have that Asian friend. And so now they're going to not do that or not speak out. But when they're not around, we can make jokes. And it's a point of connection, it's a point of empathy, it's a point of relationship, and it's often an entry point to speaking up and doing something, but it's not sustainable. Then you move to this place where, oh, it's not just John, it's all queer people. It's all people of color. It's all people who experience sexism and genderism. So, how do I want to help them? And that altruism is really about helping them. And you can do a lot of good. I think that's where we get performative. We want to be seen. Look how I'm helping them, right? There's sort of a savior hero kind of thing.
Oh, yeah.
Um,
Oh, yeah.
yeah. You've seen this, and and I think in that you can do a lot of good in that place. You can do a lot of good work, but when you get criticized, you get super defensive because what you're really trying to do in that place is separate yourself as being a good white person, an
Mhm.
exceptional man, to distinguish yourself. And often in that place, that's where folks of privilege really beat up on other folks of privilege. Have you ever seen white people that are just bash white people? Oh, white people and the things white people have done throughout history. It's an abomination. I'm like, okay, yeah.
As if they are not also a white
Yeah,
person who is
exactly.
benefiting and
Right.
participating.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or men who just bash men, like, oh, can you believe
Oh,
the shit
man.
men do? Oh my God, men are just
Mhm. The
terrible.
worst.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. And I've done that. I've absolutely done that. So I'm not above all of this. But what I've noticed is when I'm in that place, I think people who experience marginalization, when they're in that place, they're really trying to distance themselves from people who have hurt them. Right. So when women bash men, they're trying to distance from men who have hurt them. Maybe men in their lives, maybe society, maybe men at large. When I do it, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to distance myself from a previous version of myself that I can no longer be with.
Mm,
So when I bash white people, what I'm doing is I want distance from that version of me that said affirmative action is reverse racism, that I can no longer be with that perspective. And I'm ashamed that I once thought that. And so bashing white people is a great way to distance myself and say, but I'm one of the good ones. You can trust me. You can connect with me. You can be in relationship with me. You don't have to question my intentions. And so that's really separation. And when people give us feedback, hey, I love the talk, but I think that joke was a little sexist, then you get defensive because you're trying to prove I'm a good one. And that feedback is something to be defensive about because you're trying to maintain this perspective that I'm one of the good ones. No, you don't understand. I'm
mhm.
Dr. Keith Edwards. I have a
That's right.
PhD. I started this thing and I've done. And every time I get defensive, at this point, I get defensive plenty and I start in my head to run the resume. And when I get defensive and I start to think, run the resume, like, I've, no, that's my red flag. And that's when I try and move to the next stage, which is this enlightened self interest. So if someone comes up to me and says, love the talk. I thought that example was a little sexist. I go, get in touch with your enlightened self interest. If this person can help you understand a sexism within you that you are unaware of, that is a gift toward your own liberation. And you don't need to be defensive about that. You should welcome that. This is a gift, right? And then I say,
Mhm.
really? Oh, I'd love to learn more. Where did you see that? How did you see? Okay, I wasn't thinking that, but I totally get it. And sometimes I don't always agree, but I at least engage not from a place of defensiveness. I can at least really listen and really inquire and really self-reflect.
I love how you said you start running the resume.
Yeah,
There's this thing that's always in my mind, I've heard other folks share it too, is past actions don't erase current behavior. "Oh, yeah, I was there. I marched with King. I did all these things,
yeah,
but
yeah,
what are
yeah.
you doing now? What are you doing in this moment?"
I think when we get in touch, so I said, I think, oh, I'm getting defensive. I want to explain to them all the things I've done. That's that middle stage. Now I got to get in touch with my enlightened self interest. And when I have that enlightened self interest, any feedback about my sexism, about my ableism, about my non inclusiveness is just, yeah, I'd love it because I know I'm a good person. And that's not a threat to me being a good person. I'm a good person who has been taught racist things my whole life. I've been taught sexist things my whole life. I've unlearned a lot of it. And you know what happens as soon as you unlearn it? You go out in the world and you get taught it again. By social
Again and
media,
again.
by music. So
Yep.
it's not like we got socialized until we were 13 and then it stopped. I'm being socialized every day of my life in these ways. So the unlearning is really important. I'm working on a piece now about, I think learning is like 10% learning, about 50% unlearn, and about 40% relearning.
Mm,
Because when I need to learn something, like if I've gotta fix my faucet, I don't know how to do that. I look it up, I learn it. It's not that hard, right? But if I think I know how to fix the faucet and it's not working and I gotta learn a completely different way of doing it, if I think I know how the world works and functions and someone comes along and says, actually, that's not how that is, that's how racism works. I go, oh, I gotta unlearn all of that. And unlearning is really challenging. And then once you unlearn, then you get socialized and you got to relearn, you got to be reminded, you got to have another example, you got to read another bell hooks book, and then you got to see it play out here. And then you see it in this documentary, and then you see in this poem, and you're like, oh, and then you see a model of it. And then eventually you go from knowing racism exists and white privilege exists to then doing that in conversations and getting the feedback and being criticized and welcoming it as a gift and being open to it and learning that you can say racist things and get that feedback and welcome it and apologize and take responsibility. And you still get to be on podcasts like this, right? Or maybe you get to be on podcasts like this because of that, right?
because of that, yeah.
And
Mhm.
then for time going to doing and practicing and working and really effort to, that's just how I show up. You move into this being place. And I think that's where that teacher that I mentioned was. He wasn't perfect. He messed up. And when students would say things, he'd be like, oh, yeah, you're right. And he just welcomed it because it was his way of being. Now he was 55 years old, been doing it for a long time. I don't know what got him to that place, as a straight white man, but I still see him out there doing it in different venues now.
This journey of moving from defensiveness and mapping out some models of how folks can understand ways of doing that. All the things you just shared, like, how does that connect to building trusting relationships with folks?
I think perfection is insidious. Tema Okun would argue that perfectionism is a tenet of white supremacy culture. And I'll argue it's a tenet of patriarchy and other dominant cultures. And I think the message that we often get is that if I want communities of color to trust me, I have to be perfect. If I want women and trans folks to trust me, I have to be perfect. I talk about this a lot with leaders. As leaders, we want people to trust us, of course. And how we often try and do that is be perfect. We never make a mistake. We never are vulnerable. We have all the answers. We know everything. We are certain. Right? But when a leader comes to the front of the room and says, "Team, I'm so sorry. I was trying to do this and I messed it up. And there's some real consequences. It's on me. I apologize. I'll do better. This is what I've learned. And this is how I'm going to try and do better." The people in the room go, "I'll follow you anywhere. I'll follow
Yeah.
anywhere." And so I don't, I think that shift to that enlightened self interest and what you're describing, where you can be with that, if you can believe that you are a good person who's doing their best, who is fallible and going to make a lot of mistakes, but you're on a journey to improvement and your mistakes are part of that journey. They're not a deviation from that journey. Messing up someone's pronouns doesn't mean you aren't an ally. It means you got work. You got to practice. You got to practice their pronouns. I'm sorry, apologize, they, them. And then in the card, you go, they, them, they, them, they, them, they, them, right? Got to work on that, right? But the performative thing that happens is you make it about you. Oh, I'm
Make
so,
it about you.
I didn't mean to, blah, 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 it was him,
Mhm.
and you make it about you. And the person is, could you just say sorry and move on? I don't tension right now, right?
In absence of that, what happens sometimes is, okay, then it becomes about, like you said, you wanna go down the resume, then it becomes about
Yeah.
reassuring this person, "Okay, I get it, you're not a bad person, I get." But the person actively harmed is then put in this role of trying to make that person feel better. Yeah,
Responsibility on the oppressed for making the
that's right.
dominant feel better about their aggression, their
That's right. That's
microaggression
right.
or racism, or just really how their unconscious socialization is popping out. I think one of the other things that really transformed me was I was a junior in college and Cornel West spoke on my campus. For folks who don't know, Cornel West is a brilliant scholar of many things, especially racism, race and racism in this country. And he ended his talk, he was 21, saying, "White supremacy is in me. I have white supremacist thoughts. I have things where I prefer whiteness over blackness, and I notice it and I catch it." And I was just like, if this black man who has
Yeah.
been studying racism his whole life, who was a university professor at Harvard, if he has some white supremacy in him, maybe I should give up and trying to believe I don't. And it just was this permission slip to be like, okay, you do. What is it? And instead of denying it or hiding it or covering up, you become curious about it. What white supremacy shows up in me? Oh, the reason why I keep confusing those two black men's names is my racism. Oh, my brain puts people in categories based on skin color. That's terrible. And I totally do that. Let's pay attention to that. Let's notice that. Let's make sure we um, put more awareness in there than maybe other places. Um, and so that permission to acknowledge it. And I find when I mess up and I go, "Oh, thank you. Tell me more. I want to understand." Okay, great. I'll work on that. I apologize. And I think good apologies are so rare. A lot of apologies that really blame and victimhood.
"I'm sorry you were offended by," or
Yeah.
"I'm sorry you
Yeah.
took issue with."
I'm
Yeah.
sorry, but I didn't really. And I think I learned from restorative justice 4 good steps to an apology. And just talking with my 12-year-old last night, made a mistake and needs to make an apology, and working with her to figure out how to do that. And we'll walk through the 4 steps of apology, do that. But yeah, when you are vulnerable, when you make mistakes and you don't hide it, you don't cover it up, and you take responsibility, take ownership, and you apologize and you try and do better. that builds relationship. People go, "Oh, I'll work with you." In the film Color of Fear, which is probably 30 years old at this point, there's this white guy who's just super defensive, and the people of color in the room are like, not gonna deal with him. He starts crying and starts to recognize, "I don't wanna admit racism is real because if that was real, it would be so awful." And then the black man in the room who was yelled at him says, "Oh, from here I can work with you." That vulnerability, that openness, the willing to be in the conversation, the willing to be aware is how we build it. But we've been told the myth of be perfect to have all the answers, never make a mistake. That's how you build relationships, and that's not how relationships are.
I've been wanting to ask you this. I've been wanting to ask
All
you this.
right.
One, I'll just say, even in your description of the Color of Fear video, it also this isn't what I wanted to ask you, but it just came up from
Mhm.
what you were just talking.
Yeah.
The white man saying, "Oh, I couldn't believe that because that would be so terrible," and asking questions around, okay, where does the pushback, where does the resistance come in? Like those kind of statements, it just illuminates. Okay, so if I had to recognize that white supremacy is real and there are some ways I get benefits from it, what would that then mean about me?
Mhm.
What would that mean for me? And then also, what would be required of me as a white person upon taking in and accepting and acknowledging that information? So I think that highlighted one of the things that can undergird some of the defensiveness that happens. But what I've been wanting to ask you
Mm.
for some time now,
I'm
and
so excited for this.
I've saved this quote and I've used it and things that I've done,
Yeah.
facilitations and different things, I referenced it. But some years ago, you wrote about education as being an act of faith. So I'm just going to
Mm.
read this quote, and it says, when we hear messages that truly shift our entire worldview, we rarely meet them with gratitude and appreciation. Usually, we meet them with resistance. We dismiss, we argue, ignore, or worse. It often takes, and it's what you've been talking about, but it often takes
Mhm.
hearing the message again and again, years of maturity, reflection, personal discovery, other learning, or in my case,
Mhm.
all of the above. And by the time the message really connects and is internalized, the person who first got us started on that journey is nowhere to be found. So I'm wondering, for you,
Yeah.
are there folks you remember that you might mention, bring, call up now, folks on your journey who perhaps when you heard the message initially, met it with resistance, but
Yeah.
after some time, I'm asking, who are some of those folks
Yeah.
that it clicked for you after hearing the message?
A celebrity, and I'll give you a real life. The obvious one for me is Troy Hedrick, who gave that workshop and said sexual violence is not a women's issue, it's a men's issue. And I yelled at him for 2 hours. Like, I was not good. I was angry, I was defensive, I was offended, just thought it was ri and I've given that same talk more than 1,000 times. And he's still in my life, I still know him, I saw him a year ago, and he knows this, so it's a rarity. But it could have easily been me yelling at him. I'm sure he was very displeased. I'm sure he said some not nice things about me later that evening afterward in private conversations with other professional staff. I'm sure he's very frustrated with me. But that was the seed that was planted. And then when I heard from survivors, I returned to it and I was empathetic. And when I heard from sorority women, I thought, we got to do something. And although it was about helping them and performative and being the hero and getting credit and doing that, it was good work. We did good work. Now, I wasn't open to feedback, I wasn't open to criticism. It's just a step on the journey, right? It literally took years for me to go from angry, offended, scolding him to giving a TED talk on the same thing. That was a 17-year span. So education is an act of faith. And what I hope an educator like him does is says, I'm going to plant the seeds. And if it isn't welcomed, is it met with gratitude and appreciation, if it's met with anger and pushback, I'm going to know I'm planting the seeds. And maybe the third time or the seventh time or 3 years later, this will be a part of this person's journey. So when I give my talk about sexual violence prevention, there are sometimes my campus hosts are sometimes like, I'm really sorry about those three guys. They seem really upset. And I'm like, I'm not. I was them. What if in 7 years they're doing this? What if they're speaking at orientations all over the country? Right? Because
Mm.
that was where I was. So let's not see the resistance and the anger and the defensiveness as a failure. Maybe it's what they needed at this point in their journey. And how do we move
Mm,
them from that to the next place, to the next place? And maybe they're so fed up that they want to go to the women's center and complain about bringing me, and they have a conversation and they get invited to be a part of a men's group. And then they realize this. And then, it could be a year and a half and they're like one of the leaders on campus around critical masculinities and healthy manhood and all of these things. Um, the other example I'll give is when I was a sophomore in college, I was required to read Bell Hooks' Teaching to Transgress for a philosophy class, and I hated it. I thought it was uh, awful to men. It was offensive. It was the worst kind of feminism that was man hating. And then 4 years later, I ended up in a car with Gloria Watkins, who was a professor, on a job interview on a batched. As long as we're picking you up from the airport, we'll pick up her and take her back. Uh, and through the hour and a half car ride, which was
mm,
incredibly inappropriate, I learned that Gloria Watkins publishes under a pen name, which is Bell Hooks. And I sat in the front seat while Bell Hooks sat in the back seat and asked me why I would want to live in a small town that doesn't even have pornography on the local cable channel. And I was like, what is going on? And I know now that she was messing with me. And Bell Hooks has been one of the greatest teachers of my lifetime. But when I first read Bell Hooks, I was furious. Then I got assigned to read her again, and then I had this meeting with her, and more people referenced her, and I would see all these pictures and quotes on the internet. And oh, this sounds good. And then I read her in my doctoral program. I was like, this is exactly what I think. This is for all of our collective liberation. And dominant white supremacist culture and capitalism are ruining all of our lives, including those who benefit from it. I was like, yeah. And now one of my heroes. Yeah, we're all a work in progress. I think we interact with people in our lives as though they're finished. Do you ever meet someone you met 4 years ago and they said a thing and you just think you label them as that?
this is the whole of who you are. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Exactly. Meanwhile, I wake up at 3:30 in the morning going, I can't believe I said that thing in a meeting 9 years ago. I hope they don't remember that. So I know what a work in progress I am. I wish we would give the grace to everybody else around, particularly the
Keith,
people
I'm
we
not
live
gonna
with.
Keith, I'm not gonna lie to you, Keith. I have that similarly. And the fact that you said 9 years ago, literally, I have the thing where it could be years and years ago and it just pops
Yeah.
back in and it wakes me up. Oh, I hope they don't remember that. Oh, that was so embarrassing. Oh, I
Yes.
shouldn't have.
Yes.
Oh, I don't think that anymore.
But I think I live with my two daughters and my partner, and I interact with my partner as though she still thinks and believes the same thing she said last week. And I know I don't. My thinking has evolved dramatically since last week. And so, how do we recognize that we're works in progress, give ourselves the grace of that, and also people around us? What do you think about that now? I know last week you thought this. What do you think now? And I just listened to David White in a conversation that um, curiosity, unknowing, is the greatest intimacy.
Mm.
And I think that's a really beautiful way to engage with that.
You've named some folks who had a big influence on you and talked a little bit about their impacts. Are there others out there who you didn't name that you might want to
Mm,
shout out now? And also, if somehow, some way, they had a chance to come across this episode, this message, or if you see them again in person, if you had the opportunity to tell them thank you or say anything in terms of gratitude or impact, what would you say to them
yeah.
now?
I've made a list. I've got it over here. And I've named the people: Troy Hedrick, Kara Brode, Francis Kindle, Tim Wise, Bell Hooks. Those are some of the people who have really shaped me and many more. You can think you have patriarchy and sexism figured out and you've read all of Bell Hooks's books, then have two daughters. My partner and I look at each other all the time. I can't believe that just came out of my mouth. Belle would be so upset. Right. And so there's theory and there's concept, and then there's the reality of these precious beings that you would do anything to keep safe. And that benevolent sexism comes up. So I'm learning all the time from my two daughters. They are reteaching me constantly. It's fascinating to see them around issues of gender. I remember coming home in fourth grade and saying, oh, so and so is now going by a new name. And I was like, oh, okay. All right. We're going to talk about this. Like, we get this. All right. So we're going to talk, what pronouns are they using? And what do you think that means? And are they trans? Or they identify as non-conforming or non-binary? And they just literally, they just want to be called Alex. Like, why are you being weird about this? It was just such a, like a non thing. And Now that person doesn't want to be called Alex. They want to be called something else. And I was like, is that hard? And they're like, we practice at lunch with our friends. I was
We
just like
practice.
nonplussed, just like, why are you making a big deal about this? Why are you such a weirdo about this? Why are you making a big deal about it? So it gives me hope. I think one of the things I want to be sure to talk about is this notion of critical hope. Because when you invited me, you said you wanted to do this series because it's hard out there. We live in a tough time, and an election looming in November that could change our entire future. Between this conversation and when this release, there are probably 3 or 4 major things in the world that we don't even know about now that will be super concerning. And it is easy to lose hope and be cynical. And I cultivate hope very seriously. Hope is not an emotion you await or a circumstance you await, but practice. If we're trying to create learning, growth, and change, we need to be good partners on the journey. I really love this notion of hope. Shane Lopez wrote a book called Making Hope Happen. He defined hope as the belief that tomorrow can be better than today, and I have a role in making that happen. So it is a belief combined with agency. If it's
That's right.
just a belief and you don't do anything about it, that's a wish. But if you go into action not really sure if things can get better, then you're cynical. And then there's this notion of critical hope, which builds on that. And I don't necessarily distinguish them because that reckoning with reality is so important. But I think critical hope, which is 3 scholars that I turn to: Jeffrey Duncan Andrade, who talks about critical hope in urban schools; Michelinos Zembalas, who talks about critical hope in anti apartheid South Africa; and then Kari Grain, who wrote a book called Critical Hope, who talks about global engagement. And mushing their scholarship together, I define critical hope as the combination. Critical hope equals an equity lens or a reality lens, because sometimes the reality is other than equity, right? That's the reality. So what are you going to do with that? Or an equity lens, identify racism and sexism, the equity lens, plus possibility, something could be better, plus responsibility, which is the agency part. It doesn't mean you're entirely responsible, but there's something you can do. There's something you do to
Something you can do.
put your thumb on the scales towards where you want it to go. And so for me, cultivating that critical hope. So a real world example is I live in Minneapolis where George Floyd was murdered. I live in Minneapolis and I can point to a murder of a black man that happened 6 miles north of me, 2 miles east of me, 3 miles west of me, and 5 miles south in the past 7 years.
Mhm.
That's hard. That is a hard thing. And it can be easy to lose hope in that context. Or I can say, what is the reality we're working with? That's police, socialization, masculinity, militarization, training. There's a lot of things going on there. What else could be possible? I can imagine other possibilities for policing. Okay. And then what do I do about that? Well, I'm not invited to the conversation. So I can speak up. I can share things on social media. I can educate different people. I can vote. I can submit letters. What is the role I can play? I'm not on the city council. That's not the best place for me, but what is the role I can play? What do I want to do to make the world a better place in the next week, a better place for my family, a better place for my community, a better place for people I'll never know? And I think that enlightened self interest says, let's think about the people I know and love and care about, but not just them. Let's talk about all people who are harmed, right? In this example, all the black men, all the black folks, but particularly black men in my community who are afraid. And what price am I paying as a white man living in Minneapolis as a result of the racism and the murder of 4 black men in my community? It's a cost to me directly.
Mhm.
Relationships, connection, well-being, the amount of money that my tax dollars have gone to paying fines and court settlements in the state of
Settlements, yeah.
Minneapolis could have been gone to other things like improving my kids' playground. So I pay a price of the racism in my society. And when we pay attention to that, then we just don't go, oh, poor George Floyd, that's awful. We go, how do I make my community better for all of us? Thriving, growth, safety, economic well being, contributions. There's so much that can be going on. And there's so many examples of where that's happening. But I'm reminded on the mornings when I feel hopeless, then I got to cultivate hope. Don't wait for good news. Cultivate that hope. And it's a practice, just like gratitude is a practice. Cultivating that critical hope is a practice.
Finish the statements. True social justice is possible when
We recognize it is in all of our interest.
my approach to social justice is shaped by.
The understanding that transformation is about a journey and how do we help people on that journey, and vilifying and demeaning and dehumanizing them does not help.
Understanding and sharing our social justice origin stories is
Mm.
important because
It makes us relatable. I hate the mythology that Rosa Parks was just fed up and wouldn't take it anymore and did this incredible thing. She was a part of the NAACP who planned and plotted that for years and orchestrated and was activism training and was with so many other people. And she did an incredible thing, and none of that should be minimized. But when we make people like, we got to wait for the next Martin Luther King or the next Grace Lee Boggs, then we're out of agency. We're waiting for a hero to arrive rather than saying, what can I do? What's the role I can play? What can I do? So I think sharing our stories is really important to show the journey, to show the missteps, to show the basic origin story, which I shared, which I'm not proud of. But I think maybe other people will go, oh, I've said reverse racism, affirmative action is reverse racism. Maybe I could think about that too. Or I get fed up with bad messages about men, but now he's talking about it like this. And so maybe it helps connect. I think about it as a bridge, learning as a bridge. How do we be good company on that journey? And teaching me how to fix a faucet is a pretty easy bridge. It's not easy for me to do, but I'm not resistant in that process. Telling someone who is a 65-year-old white man who grew up poor with an abusive alcoholic father that he also has white privilege, that's a challenging bridge. And you got to be different company on that journey across that. If your goal is change and growth and transformation, if you just want to belittle him, that's easy. But that's not the work that I'm invested in.
on my journey and learning, I've heard this term being a good ancestor when it relates to white
Mhm.
people. And when I hear that term in conversation, it's often prefaced by this acknowledgement that historical figures, the white folks who've been resisting and who've been either working with civil rights or even current times, just recognizing like where are the recordings of the names, what are their names, and not in a way to uplift them as these savior folks, but from the point of getting other white folks off the sidelines, recognizing the importance of racial equity. Who are these folks? Why can't we name anyone? And then it's
Mm.
pointing to, okay, there's some design behind that. There's design behind making sure that we don't know these
Yeah.
names and that it's hard to think of folks like that. What comes to your mind when you hear being a good ancestor, what that means, and what are some hopes that you have in relation to that?
I love this. Like, again, if we look for perfection, but people in their time did pretty radical revolutionary things that it contributed progress, and that contributed to more progress, and that contributed to more progress. I have a very sophisticated understanding of racism and sexism and patriarchy, and it's because Bell Hooks wrote a lot of books, and Harry Brode wrote some awesome essays and chapters. And I was saying before, I have an image above my desk of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and Nelson Mandela, and all of this, I think, is important for us as white people to recognize the examples of whiteness, of white people showing up for transformation and change. For men to see the examples of men who showed up. Frederick Douglass is a great example of a man who advocated for them. And the cross training. I think cross training is where we learn. I think Frederick Douglass is a great example of someone who really understood racism, and it helped him understand his role as a man in battling sexism. This is what I want from white people around racism and abolition. And so, how do I show up around sexism and women's rights? Right. So, how do we do that kind of cross training across identities? And I think about that all the time. If I'm stuck on an issue of race, like I don't really know what to say or how to respond here. What if it was an issue of gender? Oh, I'm very clear about that. I've learned that lesson. And it's never the same, but it's often similar. And I think
Mhm.
that kind of cross training, or as pedagogy nerds call it, horizontal decollage. Cross training is a little bit more accessible. But I think we can also learn a lot from not just our white ancestors, but ancestors of all different backgrounds and perspectives and identities who have created transformation and change, and we're all building on their foundation. And our task, I think, is to take all of that work and come up with something even more sophisticated, even more nuanced, even more helpful, even in better metaphor. But I didn't come up with that metaphor on my own. I read so much stuff. I have a lifetime of things. Professor once said, I said, I'm thinking about studying this and researching this, but it's already been done. And she said, Karen Inkles, she said, scholarship is cumulative. So your job is to take what has already been done and add to it. And then someone else will take that and add to it. And I just love being a part of that lineage. I hope that my grandkids look back and go, how basic was our grandfather? Like he thought blah, 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 because they'll be so much more sophisticated and have so much a better understanding because of the things that I've contributed to and so many other people in the world. Um, I believe that progress, that moral arc of the universe bends toward justice, but we have to participate in that bending. It's not just going to happen on its own.
My hope is that these stories, these messages exist for many years to come. For
Mhm.
future generations who come across this, what would you want to share with them? What are some things you want to pass on to them, or what is something that you'd want them to know?
That oppression harms all of us. It harms us in different ways. And folks who experience privilege and dominance, you need to recognize how you benefit from that system. And then recognize how that system harms you. And that changes everything. Because then when it's hard, you don't get tired because I'm not doing it for you. I'm not doing it for my daughter. I'm doing it for me and my own liberation. It really becomes more effective, consistent, and sustainable. So I think that all of us, that enlightened self interest, I think that critical hope, I think about that daily, cultivating my own critical hope that something else is possible. There'll be setbacks, right? That arc doesn't bend always in a positive direction. There's setbacks. That's what progress looks like.
So you started when I picked up the People Who Inspire series, when I started that,
Mm.
for over 10 years ago now, and you've come back today, and it's just a moment of appreciation for coming back to support again. And yeah, thank you for being here. Keith Edwards, everybody. Keith Edwards.
Thanks so
Thank
much.
you.
Love doing it. Love coming back to it.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts and subscribe to Social Justice Origin Stories there or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also watch video episodes on YouTube at Social Justice Origin Stories, and I'd really appreciate it if you subscribe there as well. Video episodes are also available on the project website, socialjusticeoriginstories.com. I'd love to hear about how you're engaging with the stories. Share your thoughts at socialjusticeoriginstories.com/contact or by emailing stories@socialjusticeoriginstories.com. To support the work of Social Justice Origin Stories, consider becoming a monthly patron. Your contributions will help keep this research going and support its mission. Visit patreon.com/socialjusticeoriginstories to learn more and to make a contribution. Again, that's patreon.com/Social Justice Origin Stories. You can start or stop anytime. Social Justice Origin Stories is edited, hosted, and produced by me, Rolando Tompkins Jones. Many thanks to our storyteller this week and the many storytellers who have contributed to this project. And thank you for joining me this week. Take care.